And you're gaining a fan base in a place where you've never visited, you do not live, you don't speak the language, and you don't really know anything about the culture. And so you're building your house on a foundation that is like shaky at best.
You are now listening to the Creative Juice podcast brought to you by Entrepreneur.io.
What's up, Indies? Welcome back to Creative Juice. This is episode 290. We're going to be talking about Spotify, the globe, the map, cities, and your marketing. I'm your host, Jack McCarthy. With me is your co-host, Circa. Cirque, what's up, dude?
Dude, I'm so excited for this episode.
Me too, man. This one's been a long time coming, I think.
Yeah.
Really excited about this. Hey, have you heard about Spotify trigger cities, dude?
They're all the rage.
Spotify trigger cities, what they are, where they came from, the origin of this concept, why they're preventing you, and the idea of them are preventing you from growing your audience. That's what we're going to be talking about today. I think this is going to be a fun one. Cirque, how do you want to kick this off? This is near and dear to your heart.
Yeah, it's the mother of all shiny objects. Yeah, well, maybe we could provide a bit of background for like, why have you heard of trigger cities? Where did it come from? Why is this a thing?
Yeah, for sure. Let's define what are Spotify trigger cities, what is this, and what's the origin?
Yeah, so in 2018, a gentleman named Chaz Jenkins, who is now the chief commercial officer for Chartmetric. Chartmetric's an app. You can connect it to your Spotify, get tons of data that you couldn't otherwise get. And it's really useful, but this idea is not so useful. So this guy, Chaz Jenkins, he had a little bit of a mild background in data analytics as it pertains to the music industry, but he's by no means a data scientist. He's just an executive at Chartmetric. And he wrote an article where he laid out this study, quote unquote. And in this study, he basically made the claim that he studied 40 artists who emerged, quote unquote, emerged out of the Western world in a given time period. So his criteria for inclusion of people in the study was like they emerged. We don't know what that means, out of the Western world.
From the void.
Yeah. So like basically like any artist who popped off in United States, United Kingdom, Canada, so on and so forth, in some time frame he had specified, and looked at them all and noticed that they had a higher preponderance of playlist inclusion where the playlists were based in certain countries. So he figured out that like Mexico City, Sao Paulo, Brazil, which happened to be like the most densely populated areas outside of, major metros in the United States, a lot of the playlists for these artists were in those cities. And so his conclusion was that the reason they emerged out of the Western world, the reason they found success in Western countries was because of a high focus of streaming activity in sort of the major popular metros outside of the Western world. And so pretty innocuous how I described it there, like, oh, what harm could come from that? Since that article was published, which it's now taken down, it no longer exists, you can't find it. But there's follow-up articles if you search like Chaz Jenkins, Trigger Cities, people talking about this article. But since that article was published, it has been twisted and contorted to mean that if you want to break an artist, all you got to do is basically focus only on like Mexico City, Sao Paulo, Brazil, regardless of where you live, and Southeast Asian countries with like densely populated cities as well, run ads there and point them all to your Spotify and try whatever you need to do to get traction in Spotify in these cities, you should do. And the benefit being is that like, well, buying ads for Sao Paulo, Brazil is a lot cheaper than buying ads for like Chicago or New York. So you can cheaply get ad traffic to Spotify. And then our favorite phrase that's ever uttered by music marketery folks, it will trigger the algorithm.
Mm-hmm. There it is.
Because all Spotify's developers really wanted was for you to get a bunch of streaming traction in Sao Paulo, Brazil. And if you do that, they will unlock.
That's another key word.
Unlock the power of the algorithm.
We could play a drinking game from content from the time that article was published through probably now of how many times you should drink every time you hear trigger the algorithm or unlock trigger cities on YouTube. Take a shot.
Yeah, so I'll point back to an episode we did in 2019 called How the Spotify quote unquote algorithm actually works. It's episode 103. You can go to entrepreneur.io/episode 103 and you'll find it. Where I just kind of detailed, like, I spent months watching every single thing. Like, if a developer from Spotify did a talk at a machine learning conference, I watched it. If they, publish a YouTube video about what they were working on, I watched everything that the Spotify developers have ever said publicly, took extensive notes, and then formed my own sort of amalgam understanding of how does the Spotify recommendation engine actually work. And in all that research, I found nothing that corroborates the idea that all Spotify really wants to see is tons of playlists in Mexico City and they will make you famous.
Let's just unpack that concept a little bit. If you're a video game developer, right? Or really a developer of any kind, are you going to put easy buttons into the thing that you're developing?
Yeah, much less sort of arbitrary easy buttons.
Yeah.
There's a couple of things that are fundamentally wrong with this quote unquote study that make it like if Chaz Jenkins were to try to publish this article in a journal of science, it would be handily rejected. So like the reason that this conclusion that was reached and this whole trigger cities theory in general is just scientifically bankrupt. And so the first thing, and I did a live stream about this in our Indie Pro group to kind of explain it, but basically when you have a scientific study, the larger your sample size, the more confident you can be in your result. Now, 40 artists is not a sufficient sample size to reach scientific truth. Why? Because there's thousands, millions of artists who could have emerged out of the Western world during that time period or before it. So the sample size could have been 4,000 easily, but they just chose 40. And so then we go to, so sample size is too small, but how do we choose these samples? Why are we using these 40 artists? They don't say.
Yeah.
They just kind of, and the problem with like not having established criteria for how we're going to select the sample, the problem with that is that your bias creeps in. So if you have a hypothesis, your goal as a scientist, a data scientist, is to try to disprove the hypothesis. You want to prove it wrong. And so you want to set up criteria that removes your bias from it such that you get a truly random sample. That's not what they did. They found artists who quote unquote emerged out of the Western world. That's the selection criteria. But is there only 40 artists who got popularity in the US or Canada in that time frame? Probably not. There's probably many more. And then, so the sample size is too small. How that sample size was selected, they don't say. There's no selection criteria. And it seems to be like all the perfect recipe for bias to creep in. And then how they studied them is kind of flawed given the conclusion they reached, because they didn't say like, well, we tracked these artists. We saw that they had a bunch of fans in, Mexico City and Sao Paulo, Brazil and Thailand and all these, Southeast Asian and Hispanic, like Latin American cities. And then after that, they started getting traction in the US, which might better indicate that like one caused the other. But that's not what they did. They just saw that, hey, these people are popular in the US. They're also really popular in these other places. These other places, there must be something special about them that caused it. And it's like, we don't even have correlation yet. And they're already inferring causation. They're already saying,
I was going to say, this isn't even a case of correlation doesn't imply causation. It's
what the fuck are you doing? Yeah. Causation definitely does not exist. And we would need to see, in order to make this more scientific, what I would like to see is like, let's take all of the artists who had monthly listeners and streams over a certain benchmark in the US during the sample period, regardless of what their other data looks like. Let's not look for artists who have traction in these trigger cities. Let's just look for them on the basis of they're getting traction in the Western countries. So we're going to study all of the people who got this traction in Western countries that we're applying is the effect. And then we search in the data for the cause and see if there's any causation or correlation there, which would result in probably 40,000 artists, not 40. And then I would look to see the history of their streaming data, which Chartmetric may or may not have access to by location. But then you would want to see no traction in the US, traction in trigger cities, and then sometime thereafter, traction in the US. And then we'd want to control for intervention. So like, did they do something that would have gotten them popular in the US? Are there other potential causes for this popularity right now? And they really didn't do any, not even a part of that work.
Yeah. The downstream effects of this article and this concept is wild to me.
Yeah, you just Google trigger cities and it's like, holy shit.
To this day, I can't tell you the number of conversations that I want to say that I've had, but it's really what I've been put through about this topic when it comes to potential clients at our agency, existing clients at our agency, advice and consultation on marketing strategy for a concept that is scientifically bankrupt and has no good data to back it up. It's crazy the widespread effect that it's had on independent artists, especially who are out there trying to, hustle to grow.
Yeah, it's crazy the complete lack of like anyone stopping to say like, oh, is that true? How do you know it's true? Like nobody. They just heard like an opportunity and they jump. But so I do want to introduce another problem with this, which is like, okay, what are the cities that pops up in this data set that they have deemed as important trigger cities? Let's leave alone the fact that the selection criteria, the sample size, and the methodology is completely effed. And let's just ask, is there anything about these cities that might indicate that there's a very valid reason for them to appear in the data set that has nothing to do with their emergence in the Western world? And so it's like Mexico City, Mexico, Lima, Peru, Bogota, Colombia, Santiago, Chile, Jakarta, Indonesia, Bangkok, Thailand, Istanbul, Turkey. What do these places all have in common? You know?
Yeah. Low socioeconomic status.
Right? But what else?
Large population density.
Totally. You're right on the money. So they're all very low GDP, low income countries compared to the US, and they're all the most densely populated cities in those countries. In some cases, they're the capital cities. And so when you go to your Spotify and you see, oh, my top cities are New York, London, LA, and Chicago.
Wonder why.
Yeah. It's because that's where all the people are, right? So it's obvious that those would appear in your data set, and you largely have to modify your expectations. You have to account for the fact that they're so densely populated and thus will appear at the top of any geographic breakdown of your audience. They're always going to appear there. And so I'm not surprised that these cities appeared in the data set. That's obvious that would happen. And there's nothing weird or eerie or secret or like we figured something out. There's no hacks involved here. These just happen to be where all the people are.
No, dude, that's where the button is. That's where Spotify put the button.
We'll put the Trigger City's secret switch. It's like the Death Star where they have to just shoot out this one tiny switch and the whole thing blows up.
If only.
Yeah, dude. So yeah, like the reason that's a problem, the reason it's become a problem is that now artists and music marketery guru types, not to say that you can't classify us as them. I'm not saying like we're not subject to the same scrutiny. I'm just saying that like if you go on TikTok and you search trigger cities, have a blast.
You won't find me talking about it except for today.
Yeah. And so the reason that all these artists are excited is because ads to Mexico City or Lima, Peru are incredibly cheap. And so the thinking goes, well, I can pay 1/8 the ad costs per person to drive traffic to my Spotify. and then they will listen to my songs, and that will tell Spotify what type of listener listens to my songs. And then it'll distribute that to them, not local to where they are, but just anywhere. And so I'll get a good data profile. Like the more sophisticated argument that people make that I've heard is like, yeah, I will train the Spotify recommendation engine on who my ideal listener is. And then I will get a windfall of attention algorithmically from people in my own country who have the same listening habits. And the problem with that is that, one, ads run to these countries for objectives that are very easy to achieve, like click a button, watch a video, things like that. There's tons of click spam. There's tons of fake users. There's tons of bots, but there's also just click spam in general when you're targeting these countries. And because the traffic is so cheap, you could be basically, the way that Facebook ads work is that it's going to charge you more if your ad isn't relevant to the people who are seeing it. But you will never know that if you're running it to Mexico City, because more is like a shred of like what you would pay in the US for the same violation. So that's the problem, is that it's masking whether or not your ad is good. It is getting you tons of click spam. And then it's also resulting in a data profile of a person who is culturally miles apart from your ideal listener in your own country. And you're gaining a fan base in a place where you've never visited, you do not live, you don't speak the language, and you don't really know anything about the culture. And so you're building your house on a foundation that is like shaky at best. And you're wasting tons of money and time doing it. And we frequently have indies like come in the group who have like completely messed up their Instagram profile and even their Spotify listener data with like, yes, sketchy playlisting, but also sketchy traffic.
Yeah, it's true. And I was going to say, it's a nice addition to, not only has this idea infiltrated the way that people run ads for their music, but it's also infiltrated the way people think about the validity of playlists in areas that would be considered trigger cities, right? All of a sudden, oh, if I get playlisted in Indonesia, like it's not a total loss because it might be a trigger city, win, when in reality that doesn't exist.
Yeah, it's a major problem that I've never seen. I've never actually spoken with an artist who was like, oh yeah, I exclusively advertise to, Guayaquil, Ecuador, and that's all I ever focus on. And now I'm blowing up in the United States. Like that's never happened once.
No.
Furthermore, of the people who do report success with trigger cities, they're also doing shitloads of other things that are all helpful to growing a fan base.
Yeah.
And so there's no real data backing in those anecdotal cases, because just doing the things they were doing already would have probably yielded success if the music was good. So it's impossible to tell. And then on top of that, people get this, like I frequently will see indies who are struggling to grow a fan base in their home country. And so they are always looking for a shiny object. They're looking for a way to cure that problem without running straight through it. They want to go around it, right?
Yeah.
So like the incentives are very strong for an indie artist who's struggling and hasn't really done anything that's worked to grow their fan base in the US or Canada or UK to then go target a country they have no experience with and a culture they have no experience with, because they think it's the magic bullet. It's the answer to all their problems. When in reality, like, number one, the only way over is through. The only way to get a fan base of any kind and to be successful as an artist is to crack the problem you actually have, which is probably a problem of the music itself or, your commitment to content. Like your commitment to content probably plays a much larger role in the troubles you're having than where you target your ads. And so, they end up like wasting like years, thousands of dollars on this sort of bankrupt theory. And there's, anyways, I'm not going to keep rambling.
No, I think that it's worth saying here that I agree with you, and I've experienced similar, especially talking with artists who have really put a lot of time, effort, energy, and money into this concept, into running ads to, countries where the trigger cities are, and maybe did playlisting for the same purposes or whatever, any kind of marketing to hopefully shortcut them into growth in their home country, especially the US. And so often the conversation is, how do I reverse course here? How do I do it better? And the most damaging, I think, actually, is for the people that are starting to get traction, here in the US, for example. They're starting to get some fans, but they're dealing with data pollution. And I don't just mean data pollution in terms of like, oh, I can't really see who my real fans are, but more so like, yeah, I post stuff and it gets a bunch of likes from profiles that everyone and their mother can tell are not real. And that makes me look less credible to the actual fans that I'm getting now. And that's the thing I think that sucks the most. That's the longer term sort of downstream effect, is like, you look fake, and you look more fake than the major label artists that are getting, botted streams pumped into them on the regular.
Yeah. So like I want to address the problem of, because like I think the most pernicious or persistent element of this theory that convinces people that it's the right thing to do is that there's an element of truth in this, in that the Spotify recommendation engine only looks at the actual streaming record of every user. That's the main input. Primary input is collaborative filtering, which is just, let's look at all the users and all the tracks and see where they coincide. Then let's make inferences on that basis. So if Jack and I have the exact same listening history except for one song, that song is going to get recommended to Jack. Because we're pretty much identical except for this one song. And so Spotify knows I have to show that to Jack. He'll probably like it. And so the theory is that, well, if someone's willing to listen to my song in Istanbul, Turkey, then they're going to have similar listening habits to someone who would like my song in the US. And so I'm just going to flood the recommendation engine with those users, and then it'll train the recommendation engine to who to show my music to in the US, and it will show it to them. And number one, we've never seen that happen. Number two, in Mexico City, or just any of these cities in those countries, there is all types of cultural differences between them and your home country if you live in the West, right? And so in Mexico, for example, it's common for just anybody to enjoy bando music. You know what bando music is? It's like Mexican polka. These bands is like 30 members of the band. There's accordions. And it's just like, culturally, you would never know that in the US, but it's like one of the most popular types of music in Mexico. And nobody in the US listens to it except for people who are native to Mexico or have some cultural tie to it. And so you wouldn't know that because you don't live in Mexico. And your listener who's listening to your song in Mexico might be a fan of them. They might be a fan of legacy artists in Mexico who are more related to Celine Dion than they are related to your music, but they're just the cultural stars of that country. And so, no, I would argue with the idea that the listening profile of the users you're going to get in a trigger city correlates to the listening profile of someone in the US because of those cultural differences.
Yeah. Which makes a ton of sense.
Yeah. Yeah. And then another troubling aspect of this is let's say you don't do it with ads. Let's say you do it with playlists. Because already if you get playlists in the US or in your home country, wherever you live, the playlist listeners are the worst data you can feed Spotify because they are very transient in terms of their listening habits.
Passive.
Yeah. And so even intra playlists, there's wild swings. A user might like half a playlist and hate the rest.
Dude, that's me. Yeah. I have tons of playlists in my Spotify library where I will skip around all over the place. Tons of playlists where I don't like any of the artists. Even more so, tons of playlists that are genre-based playlists where I might skip around because half of the artists on there are artists that came up in the last 2 years that I just don't care about and don't really like.
Yeah. And so Spotify not only uses that listener data and collaborative filtering, it also uses playlists as an input to its recommendation engine, because playlists are essentially text documents. They're just a description, a name, and a list of artists and the names of the songs and their lengths. And so they can use that text data to infer associations between tracks. So like if you and I have a song, you have a song, I have a song, we appear on the same playlist. Just the fact that we appear on it, even if no one's ever listened to it before, can have an impact on the recommendations. And the problem with that is that, like, one, the listeners who are listening to you on a playlist may not be right. They may not be the very best type of listener for Spotify to recommend your music to. And then the playlist itself is an input whereby the fans of the artists who appear on that playlist probably aren't your ideal listener. And so you're feeding it all of this cloudy data and making it very hard for Spotify to make accurate recommendations. And the way you might notice that manifesting is that if you get a Discover Weekly distribution of like a couple hundred to 1,000, and then it quickly dies off and you stop getting Discover Weekly distribution on that single, what that means is that Spotify tried really hard to show your song to people who might like it, and it just couldn't find any because the data it was using to try to find them was faulty, or the song sucks. Two potential outcomes. And so, yeah. And so that type of thing can happen a lot if you are trying to like hack the algorithm, which is really a complex recommendation engine. The best way to get the recommendation engine to work in your favor is to feed it your ideal listener and the person you want to be your fan who happens to just love your music. If you can give it tons of those people, then you'll do very well. And so you might think, well, if I'm running ads, I'm doing that. I'm giving it the right listener. And it's like, not exactly, because you have no cultural similarity to that listener. And so your ability to actually please them or give them like the experience they want is limited. I say all that to say that like, this shouldn't be controversial, but like build a fan base in the country you live in, right? Or at least like grew up in. Because you know everything about the culture and the language and the people and the trends and the slang and everything that goes into subconscious identification with an artist. All the odds are stacked in your favor in the country you grew up in or live. And all the odds are stacked against you in, you know, if you don't live in Istanbul, Turkey, or have never been to Turkey, like, don't run ads there. Like, don't focus on it.
The playlist example is an interesting one because the real life in-person equivalent of that would be like, oh yeah, I booked myself for a music festival in Mexico City for a local event with 15 or 30 other bands on the bill. And it has a huge built-in audience, but I don't know if any of them are going to like me.
Right. Yeah. It's tough because, like, for instance, Mexico City is like, rock is alive in Mexico City, in a way it's not in the US. And that mostly pertains to more legacy rock acts, but it's just like a weird cultural nuance that Mexico City just happens to love rock music. And the US has largely paid it little attention over the last decade. Like you might think like, well, that's where I should go. I should go focus on Mexico City. And it's like, still probably not, because you're a new artist and the reports of Mexico City's love of rock music and the like filled concerts are all based on more legacy artists and not on new artists. And then secondarily, like, you don't live there. You're going to like tour there as a matter of first principle. That makes absolutely zero sense. So yeah, it's tough it's a pernicious myth because it's tough to really shake people loose of it, because it's so attractive. It's like, I can pay very little money. I'm going to blow up my Spotify. It's like, man, just by the law of averages, right? We can determine that's not true. We could just assume it, knowing what we know about mathematics. It's like, who ascends to the top of any field? The person who's willing to do the most shit that others aren't willing to do. If everyone else is willing to do it, they're not going to be at the top. So they're by nature doing things that other people are not willing to do. What are those things? It's the hard things. So when you hear this claim that like, oh, the actual way to succeed is very easy and costs you very little money and it's going to be so much better than actually working hard and doing the things that seem hard, it's like, that's probably not true.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's why I felt it like necessary to like speak or provide a position statement on this Trigger Cities idea, because I've never actually really seen it work that well. There's never been any real rigorous scientific study of the claim. And I largely hope that music marketery people just stopped saying it.
It's crazy that, 5 years later, we're still talking about this. Like, how many conversations have we had about this on the record, off the record, inside our community and out? It's wild that we're still talking about this, but I am glad that we brought it to the show because it's still persistent. It's like the freaking cockroaches that won't go away. They just won't die.
Given that it's so easy to do and costs less money than doing things, the other way, and it's such a great hack, you would expect that it would be like the industry standard. You would expect that we would have all these artists who blew up in the Western world, quote unquote, by just running Trigger City's strategy. But we don't have that. That hasn't yet manifested. And so the assumption in your mind, I believe, should be, oh, this is actually bullshit and stupid.
Yeah. And to take that a step further, I have seen firsthand of marketers and markety type people, music markety type people, gurus, whatever you want to call them, that talk about this strategy or have talked about trigger cities and more specifically targeting countries where these trigger cities supposedly exist.
Trigger because it triggers the algorithm, just to remind everyone.
Just to be clear.
It triggers it.
I have actively seen those same people recommend that if your advertising starts to skew your spend towards one of those countries where the trigger cities exist, which the ads platforms, Facebook, TikTok, whatever, it will do that by nature of engagement and CPMs.
The cost per result. It's trying to get you the best cost per result. That's what you told it to do.
I have actively seen those people recommend removing that area, that country, from the targeting. It just points to the conclusion that we've been talking about this whole episode, is that the whole trigger cities theory is baseless. Because if it wasn't, wouldn't you want the platforms to drive all of your spend to those areas?
Yeah.
These are the things that we see.
Yeah. So like hopefully from this episode, you take away that okay, well, I now know where this trigger cities concept started. I've heard the argument as to why that claim is probably wrong. And I understand the damage it could do to my artistic career. I could waste years and months and lots of effort. I could waste tons of ad spend. I could end up with a completely polluted data profile, both on Spotify and social. And then I could be the same place I am today in a year's time, having expected things to be wildly different.
That's the biggest danger, dude. That is the danger.
It super sucks.
That's the biggest danger. It's terrifying.
Yeah. Hopefully you've taken all that away from this and you have at least a critical or a skeptical eye towards this concept, more so than you did when you started the episode. The last thing I want to say about it is a common retort or a common thing that comes up when we talk about this is nationalism or ethnocentrism. And I am by no means saying that a fan in Mexico is not something you want to have. I'm by no means saying that these cities or countries are worse cities or countries. My only thing that I want to get across is that if you live in Istanbul, Turkey, don't run ads to the US. If you live in Mexico City, don't run ads to Canada. Focus on your backyard, man. Because if you can't get traction in your own backyard, there is no hack or workaround that's going to bring it to you. Furthermore, if you grow a huge fan base in Mexico City, but you live in Los Angeles, guess what? Your rent is way more than any of your fans.
Yeah.
What you pay for groceries is way more. And so if you want to sell them products, if you want to monetize that fan base, you're going to need 30x, 40x the size of the fan base you would need in your own backyard, because the local economies are so vastly different. They cannot afford to buy your $20 t-shirt.
I didn't think that we were going to have a disclaimer towards the end of the episode, just letting people know that we're not racist.
Yeah. Well, it's a common thing that comes up.
That outlines why.
Yeah, the last refuge of someone purporting this trigger cities theory is to just like on the internet, it always is. As soon as someone is proved wrong, the next step is to call the other party racist because you'll automatically win the debate and it comes up. So I just wanted to state that I have no penchant for, Western countries and I have no bias against Southeast Asian countries. What I'm saying is that it is provably and obviously stupid to focus all of your efforts on building a fan base in a place you have no experience with. So by all means, if you live in Lima, Peru, like that's what you should focus on. But if you live in Kalamazoo, Michigan, let's start with the US, man.
That's a great clincher. This was fun.
Yeah. Yeah. And if you have anything to say about this, you got any comments or retorts or questions, check out the episode on YouTube and leave them. I would love to know, because I just want to do my part to educate and make clear, why we would think that this is so obviously bullshit and why it's damaging. And if you don't understand that or you have questions, please let us know.
Yeah, we'll leave a link to that in the show notes so that you guys can check it out. Join us inside the Indie Pro community. This is the kind of stuff that we spend all day, every day talking to artists just like you about. So if you're not in there, get in there. Speaking of the Indie Pro community, as we're wrapping up this episode, you're listening to So Cold by Cryptic One. He is one of our Indie Pro.
Oh my God. Wait. Okay. So this dude, hold on, because I just want to give a special shout out to Ian Goldberg. This dude started the Addams Family, which I'm a underground hip hop nerd, like since I was like 10. And I was listening to this dude's records. He's the producer for the Addams Family. And I've been like listening to him forever. And it's just so crazy that he's in our community and he's had like awesome sales success and marketing success, because like I'm a true fan. So big shout out to Ian Goldberg.
Ian rules. This is So Cold by Cryptic One, aka Ian. He's one of our Indie Awards winners. If you want to be among the ranks of Indie Awards winners next year, join us inside Indie Pro. We'd love to see you in there. Enjoy the tunes. Peace out, Indies.